Alright. Hi everybody. I think everyone knows who I am, but my name's Butler. I went to college for theatrical lighting design at Illinois State University and Webster University in St. Louis. I've worked professionally in the theater and for live entertainment venues all throughout the Midwest, Texas, Pennsylvania, and currently I work for a television station in Lansing. I have done many shows at Bay City Players, and for the last several years I've been one of the folks taking charge of the Stages of Discovery program. And today what I thought I'd do is what's called a visual history. When I was in Webster University, one of the classes that we had to take was called visual history, and what it was a history showing trends in art, architecture, clothing, fashion, using visual means. Instead of just talking about it, we got to see where they evolved into. So what I thought I'd do today is a short visual history of lighting equipment. What you see back here is a presentation I'm going to be running. I will include a link to this presentation. It's in PowerPoint, so you can go ahead and download it and take a look while the video is playing if you can't see it very well on your screen. This first picture here is an amphitheater in Athens, Greece. This is one of the very first theaters, and of course, being outside in the ancient world, there was no artificial illumination, so most of the events here would have taken place during the day so that you could use the sun. Of course, you can see if you look close that there are some lights out there now. That's a modern innovation, of course. Once we started moving theaters or desiring to move theaters indoors, we had to have some way of lighting. The first one to be used was candles. The problem with candles, of course, they create smoke depending on what kind they are. They can flicker, they don't last very long, they're not very efficient, they don't create a lot of light. And of course they're an open flame, which in a theater can be extremely hazardous. What you see here is a depiction of what we refer to as footlights, because they're down low, they're very close to an actor. They generally would have something behind them in order to shield them from the audience so they weren't being blinded, and also to try and reflect a little bit more light out to the stage. This next one is the next innovation in lighting. It was gas lighting. This would use a jet of gas that had been ignited inside of usually glass fixture in order to create a lot more light than a candle does. Of course, the problems are that it's still an open flame. Depending on the kind of gas used, it could be very smoky. It also could be extremely inefficient. And gas is not exactly the most easy to use fuel in an installation like a theater. This particular image shows what we refer to as a manifold, which is where the gas would come in and be distributed to all the various fixtures throughout the building. The next innovation was what we refer to as a limelight. You may have heard that term before. I know I've used it in some of the times that I've spoken about lights for stages, but this is an example of one, and what you have here is a piece of lime that is being basically set on fire, although it's not really burning, that is getting so hot that it's glowing and creating light. This is a little diagram showing you how it actually works. You'd have a piece of calcium oxide, which is your lime, with a flame being directed at it. And usually you have oxygen and some sort of fuel. Hydrogen is one. There's a lot of different kinds that you can use. And you would have an adjustment so that you could move it and bring it up and down. So that's basically how that would work. You'd have just a glowing piece of rock. The next innovation, of course, once we started to get electricity, was carbon arc. And what that is using two electrodes that are spaced very close together in order to form an arc between them. And an arc can be extremely brilliant, very bright. And you would have a reflector and a body to focus the light out to where you want it to go. This particular one is a movie projector, but you could have them in the theater in things like spotlights especially. This one is an extremely old one, but these kinds of lights are still in use today. So you'd have back here where the arc would be. Sometimes you'd have lenses in order to focus your beam, you'd have some colors occasionally, and a shutter and an iris in order to kill the light without turning it off. Our next major innovation, well, they could get big. This one's a Searchlight. This is a carbon arc. If you've ever seen the premieres with the big searchlights going, that's what these would be. They would be carbon arc lights that are on very large trailers, and they create a lot of light. Our next innovation was incandescent lighting, and what this is basically an upgraded version of the old incandescent lights you'd have at your house. You have a filament in a glass envelope, we call it a bulb, that would hold a pressurized gas in order to let this metal filament become extremely hot and glow without burning and basically blowing out. So this is what's called a halogen tungsten light, or tungsten halogen. The reason is the filament is actually made of tungsten, and you'd have a halogen gas inside under pressure in order to allow that tungsten to get as hot as possible. These were used in lights like this originally, which were just a can with a reflector shooting light out the front. I refer to these a lot of times as light cannons, but they're actually just called beam projectors. We do have a few of these still at Bay City Players. They're not used very often, but sometimes you just need a lot of light in one spot, and that's what these are still used for. Our next light here is what's called an ERS, Ellipsoidal Reflector Spot. This particular one is one of the very early ones because you can see this is the lamp housing, and it's in an angle like this. So you'd have a housing, you'd have the body of the light with a reflector inside, you'd have a lens tube which has your lenses, you could put color gels in the front here, and you'd have shutters in order to shape the light, and of course a yoke to hang it on. This particular light is what really is the basis of modern lighting. It's extremely common. All the same kinds of features that you would have on a modern light are present in this light. The next light to show you here is when we start getting tungsten halogen or incandescent lights in very large fixtures. This particular one is a spotlight. You see it has a place for your gel. You'd have a reflector back here. The lens could move, or the lamp could move back and forth in order to create a very wide pool or a very narrow pool. This, of course, is another form of ERS. This is the one that's by a company called Century. This, again, is a very, very modern light. Even though it's extremely old, it still has all the same features that we look for in a very basic light today. You have your shutters, you have your lens tube, you have your body, the lens, the lamp housing, and of course your yoke goes up this way. And these came in various sizes. This one is one of the early Fresnel lenses, or Fresnel lamps. What we have here is a Fresnel lens. Inside here is there's a lamp on a train that can move back and forth. And because you start having lenses, you start being able to focus your light a lot more. You are able to bring it down to a very small area, or you can bring it out to a very large floodlight. The term Fresnel, by the way, refers to the lens, and what you have here is a very complicated lighthouse lens, and that's where Fresnel lenses are still used today. Because they're able to use a lightweight lens, and the reason is these steps. So having a lens with a very large surface area, it absorbs the heat, it can reduce the amount of light that goes through it. The other problem is that they're very heavy. Glass is also expensive for a long time. So what you would have is a very large lens that has been cut down with these steps in it. So the steps are able to spread the light out or narrow it down depending on which direction it's going through it. This is an example of the lens train that's in a Fresnel lens, or a Fresnel light. You have the socket where the actual lamp sits in. You have a reflector. This one's rather dirty, but you can imagine it would be highly polished when it was new. We also have what are called strip lights. These are still in use in a lot of places. And what it is it's for toning a cyc or a backdrop. You can use generally 3 or 4 circuits. So you have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and they repeat on and on. You can adjust each of them individually. Generally, you would put different colors, so red, green, and blue in this one, and these became extremely popular. In fact, they're still used in a lot of high schools and elementary schools that don't have a full-on theater. If you ever go to any of the older Catholic schools here in town, in Bay City, they actually, a lot of them still have their strip lights above the stage in the gymnasium. That most of them were installed in the 50s and 60s, and they're still being used today. So they were used also for general illumination in those kinds of places where you didn't have a very large lighting inventory. And of course you have each of those lamps, each of those lights had a color, and it generally used to be glass. Nowadays, of course, it's gel, just like every other light. This one is called a scoop light. A lot of places use these as work lights because they just put a lot of light down in one area, and they can be run off of the same lighting system that you use for the stage. You can, of course, use these in a regular, as part of a regular lighting plot. They have a space to put a very large gel, and you can also use them in very specific applications. This one's what we call a PARCAN, Parabolic Aluminized Reflector. What this is a very simple instrument. You have just an empty tube or a trash can with a very large lamp in the back, and that's it. What these are for a lot is downlighting, backlighting, where you don't really have to shape the light at all, but you need it in one area and a lot of it. These are still being used today, of course. One of the big ways that they are being used is in concerts, and here we have an example of a lot of PARs being used in one spot. What we have here are PARCANs on a bar above a stage, and of course an intrepid stagehand rappelling down from the heights. We also notice these lights here. I'll get to these later. Those are called track spots. Eventually, though, we kind of standardized the look and feel of ERS lights. These are by a company called Altman. This is a version called 360Q, and this is basically a very standard light. Many places still use these lights. In fact, they still make them. They're still being purchased new, and they're very common. They, for a long time, were industry standard. But you see, even these very modern new lamps, fixtures, have some of the same features that we saw in those very early ones. You have your lamp housing, you have the body, the lens tube, you have shutters to control where the light's going, you have a place to put your gel, a yoke to hang it from. You also have the gobo slot where you can slot in the gobos to create patterns on the floor. And this is what the reflector inside an ERS looks like. As you can see here, it's a faceted, aluminized reflector. Basically, it's just a very bright, shiny piece of metal that has been worked in order to direct a little bit more light out the front of the instrument. Once we get into the mid-90s, we have, this is called a Source 4. It's made by a company called ATC, and it may be familiar to anybody that has ever been in the Bay City Players, because we do have a lot of these lights. This particular one is a 750. It's a big boy version. We have quite a lot of Source 4 Juniors and smaller versions at Bay City Players. But again, you have the same kind of idea. You have your lens tube, place to put your color, shutters to shape the light, a yoke to hang it from. This is your body and your lamp housing at the back. This is an example of a Source 4 reflector. As you can see, it's slightly different than the regular ERS, and what they did was, this was one of the first lights to use computer modeling to help shape the reflector in order to maximize the light output and reduce the heat as much as possible. This is one example of some of the various kinds of accessories you can use in an ERS, especially a Source 4. This is what we call a twin spin. What we have here are two gobos stacked one on top of the other with a motor that can turn them at the same rate, at different rates, different directions, the same direction, all controlled through a protocol we refer to as DMX, digital multiplexing. And that's the basic communication protocol that we use in the theater. Everything that plugs into a light board nowadays uses DMX of some sort. This is another kind of accessory that you can use on a modern light. This is called a color scroller. What you would do is have two reels inside that have color wrapped around them. There's a motor inside, controlled by DMX, that pulls it through and changes the color coming out of the light. This is one way to get more colors in fewer lights in order to maximize how much light you're able to use in one plot. This particular one here is called the Source 4 PAR. This is the same kind of lamp that's being used in the Source 4s, ERSs, but this is a much different light. This one is more for flooding an area. And the differences between this one and the old style PARs is you can use the same lamp, but because this lens is interchangeable, you can change the shape and the size of the pool of light that it creates. With the old PAR 64s, you could do that as well, but you had to buy different lamps for the different applications because the lens was basically part of the actual lamp. Once we get a little bit farther from conventional lights, we have what we call intelligent lights. This particular one is one of the very first. It's called Very Light VL1. It's from 1981. And this particular light, the way this works is you'd have an interface coming from a controller, usually a light board, and you would have one motor that would spin this whole unit. You would have another one that would spin it up and down, and you would have generally a small motor inside in order to change the shape or the throw of the lamp as well. So you'd have a small little motor with a lens inside. These were extremely popular in rock concerts and very quickly started to take over the industry. In fact, you can still find lights that would look very similar today. This particular one, again, is what we refer to as a moving head light. You would have this base here, which would stay steady. You'd have one motor that would move this yoke, and another that would tilt the light up and down. Nowadays, we are using LED lighting in these so that you can actually have different colors depending on how you actually use the LEDs inside. Again, all controlled through DMX. This is just another example showing that you can have lots of different manufacturers making these lights, but they all look very similar. This particular one is made by ETC, the same people that use the source or that build the Source 4. This is a track spot. I told you we'd get to those. This was a different take on an intelligent light. Instead of having the whole light move, all you had was a small mirror up here in the head that would move around and point the light where the designer wanted it to go. Generally, these were a little less reliable, and they're not being used as much, but they do have very specific use cases that we still use them for even today. This particular one is a different kind of take on that same idea. This would be an accessory that you could put on a Source 4 or similar light in order to turn any light into an intelligent light. This one's made by Roscoe, which is a company that primarily makes gels and scenic paint. But this was one accessory that I thought was kind of interesting because what it's doing is it's using that same concept of a moving mirror in order to create an intelligent light out of a conventional fixture. And of course, in touring acts and such, we get a lot of these in one spot. As you can see here, this is one way of doing it where you would have lots of different lights on a bar, and they could all be mounted individually. Generally, these were put in cases, 4 to a case, so that you don't have these lights out loose running around because they are more fragile and more delicate and more sophisticated than a conventional light. You also end up having LEDs that aren't intelligent. This particular one is a floodlight or a wash light, and all it is a set of LEDs that you can change the color. It's the easiest way to get lots of different colors in one spot using one light. We have quite a few of these at Bay City Players mounted up in the ceiling at the front of the stage. This is a different take on the same idea, just showing a different configuration of LEDs. And you can also use LED lights in conventional fixtures. This particular one is a retrofit for Source 4s in order to use a LED light within a regular Source 4 instrument. Now what you have advantage-wise is an LED can be significantly brighter for much less power usage, creates a lot less heat, they can last a lot longer than a conventional incandescent fixture, and they also can be addressed directly through DMX, so they can be powered from a regular wall outlet and then have a DMX control sent to them. You don't even really need a dimmer board anymore, or a dimmer rack for this kind of an installation anymore. And of course, once we get into some of the more specialized lighting, you get some very strange lights that we do use quite often for special effects. This particular one is a strobe light, so it creates that flashing effect. We also have black lights that you can get in the theater for different effects. Some of these are just purpose-made black lights. Other times you can get special filters to use in regular stage lighting to create a black light-like effect. Once you have your instrument, you need some way to power it. This was some of the very first dimmers in the theater, and what these are saltwater dimmers. So you'd have a clay pot with electrodes that go in. Depending on how far they're submerged, that determines how much electricity is passing through to the light, which determines how bright it is. Disadvantage of these, of course, is that they're corrosive. Salt water is corrosive. It was a maintenance hog. They also were not very reliable, and you had to have a mechanical linkage going up to whatever was controlling these. Once we started having dimmers, we needed some way to control them. This particular one is a very old, what we call Frankenstein board. What you would have here is different levers control different lights, bright, brighten and dim. You would generally have two sets so that you could have one preset while the other one was actually being lit. You'd have a wheel to manually fade between the two settings. And these can be very large. They were also what we refer to as bespoke, which meant they were completely custom. They were different for every theater, and none of them were really standard. Although they did have some concepts that were shared, a lot of times how they were laid out, how they actually controlled the lights could vary considerably, even within the same city, even based on different installations by the same manufacturer. This is just another version of that same kind of lighting system, showing you how complicated they really could get. Once we moved out of that, we moved into solid state or fully electronic dimmer racks. This particular one is called a sensor rack. It's made by UTC, and these are pretty much industry standard now. This small one still has enough power going through it to power 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's 24 lights that you can fit on this one dimmer rack. And this is what they look like inside. You have all the electrical components within that one little unit, and that would power 2 circuits. So as you see here, there's 2 different breakers because they go to 2 different circuits. They're controlled individually. Different manufacturers make different kinds. This particular one is a CD80 made by Strand. As you can see, this one is permanently installed in a location. You'd have all your power cables coming in and out, and you'd have a control cable coming down into the brains of the dimmer rack. This is just another version of a dimmer pack. This particular one is portable. It's made by Strand. It's a CD80, and you can also power 32 lights off of this one pack. Generally, these are used for smaller venues, places that may need to move their lighting equipment from one venue to another. The disadvantage, of course, is that you have to remember how to wire each circuit into each dimmer pack. And of course, these can get extremely complicated. This is one from what we call Glastonbury. It's a festival over in the United Kingdom, and this is the area known as Dimmer Beach. Why they call it Dimmer Beach is a complete mystery to most people I know. No one really has a very good explanation for it. It's just one of those terms we use. So what you would have here is a lot of different lights coming into these dimmer packs or dimmer racks. And each of these would go out over the stage to the various lights. In order to determine which circuit is plugged into which dimmer, a lot of times you would have what's called a patch panel. This is an old style patch panel where you're doing it all manually. Each of these corresponds to one channel and one dimmer, and you can put various circuits into the same dimmer so that you can have two distant lights be controlled by the same dimmer. These are still being used today. This particular one is in use at the TV station I work at right now. We use this primarily for power distribution though. We don't actually dim anything that's fed from this. In fact, if you see here, this very bright tape over here is denoting the breakers which our weather computers are plugged into out in the studio so that you don't turn them off. This is another take on a patch panel. Most of the people I know refer to these as click patch. What you have here are different channels with the various dimmers. So you would move these white levers and put them into whichever dimmer you wanted to control. Some installations of these are still being used today. They do tend to be a little more maintenance heavy, mostly because you have to keep these pots clean so that you don't end up having an instant where something is conducting electricity through it and you can shoot sparks out. Ask me how I know. In order to control those old style lighting systems, you would have something like this. This is a completely manual preset board. What you would do is you would have a few different lights that you could control, and you would have a couple of different scenes, and you would manually fade. This is the same idea as those old style boards, but they're just getting smaller. It's all the electronic revolution bringing the size of these down. These were also mostly bespoke, which meant they were completely custom. Some of them got rather strange. This particular one may look like a pipe organ. Pardon me. But what this is actually is one of the very first large lighting consoles made by Strand over in the UK. And it was modeled after a pipe organ because they figured it was a easy way to transition someone into it. So you had various different stoppers that were being used for different lighting effects or circuits going into various pots where they would adjust the level, and you could manually fade between the two. Once we started getting into computerization though, you started getting things like this. This is one of the very first computerized lighting boards. All this was basically was a microcomputer. I know it doesn't look very micro, but that's what they called them. Hooked into a very custom keyboard and running a very specialized program. Generally, these were the first boards that you could actually have a cue list on. Generally, you had to save them after every show onto a floppy drive, floppy disk, because these did not have any hard drives to speak of, especially the very first ones. We also started getting into various designs for light boards, but as you can see, or you will see, they start to get very similar looking. This particular one is made by ETC. It's a Microvision. As you can see, you have your keyboard or interface, you have a way to save the show, and you have a monitor showing you various information. Generally each channel with an intensity, sometimes a cue sheet telling you what your cues are going to do, and various other very basic information on the first ones. They can get kind of complicated. This particular one is called Light Palette, made by Strand, and this was state-of-the-art for late 80s lighting. You would have a way to save your show, you'd have your interface, monitors showing you various things or bits of information about your show, and a lot of these faders you could use as submasters, or you could tie lots of channels into one sub and adjust them all at the same rate. That made programming very easy because you could program certain groups of lights into those, adjust them all, save it, go to the next one very quickly. This one would be familiar to some of the older Stages kids. This one is an Innovator made by Colortran. We had a version of this at Bay City Players up until very recently, and as you can see, it's still kind of the same idea. You have your interface, you have your faders, your monitors showing different information. This one is one of the first ones that really started to try and integrate moving lights control into a standard lighting console. Because generally, if you had moving lights, at the time you were using something like this is called a Grandma. And what this is a very specialized lighting console made for using lots of moving lights in one production. Generally, these were used on things like concert tours, major Broadway shows, anywhere that you would have a lot of moving lights in one production. But then you start getting into very recent. This one is made by ETC, it's an Element. And while it still looks pretty similar to the older consoles, you have your interface, your faders, your monitors showing different information. As you can see, it's gotten extremely complex. You can customize everything about the monitors, showing you different windows, showing you different things about the show. You can adjust things like LEDs within the actual console and see what colors you're actually going to create. And these are basically just computers now. This particular one is running Windows 7, and it's basically a very fancy keyboard hooked up to a Windows computer running a very specific program. And that's where we are as far as lighting technology today. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. I'll check it periodically. We may do more videos about lights later on. I don't know. Depends on how this all shakes out. But I hope you enjoyed a short visual history of lighting technology.